Hello everybody, this is Mike, who was like God, and this is the promised video on the Book of Enoch. The Book of Enoch is a very interesting book. You may have heard about it, you may have even read it. Jesus would have known about it, the disciples would have known about it. People in Jesus' day, a lot of them, most of them probably, would have heard about the Book of Enoch and they would have known about it. So we as Christians, what should we make about the Book of Enoch? Does the Book of Enoch belong in our Bibles? Because there are concepts in Enoch that are reflected in the New Testament, and there are times like in Jude 1:14 where Enoch is actually getting quoted. So today, friends, we're just going to look plainly at the facts, look at the facts, and see from there about Enoch and if it belongs in our Bibles or not. So I pray that the Lord will make this video a blessing to the church and even the non-believers who see it. So, what is the Book of Enoch? Now, the Book of Enoch, if you want to get all fancy, is called an apocryphal book written between the Old and New Testaments. It's part of what's called the intertestamental books. Basically, there are a lot of religious books being written between the Old and New Testaments, and these books between this time, roughly a period of 400 years, between when the last prophet had spoken to Israel, Malachi, to the birth of Christ is about 400 years. In that time, a lot of these religious books are being written, and that's right, intertestamental between Old and New Testaments. Enoch is one of them. Now, the most famous part of this book is called 1 Enoch. Now, if you're talking about Enoch, understand you're talking about 1 Enoch, chances are. Now, I'm going to go through Enoch and what it's about, and I want you to have 2 takeaways at the end of this. So, Book of Enoch, 1 Enoch, is basically made up of different parts that have built upon each other over time. So it's compiled and have developed over time. And a lot of scholars have the basic consensus that it was run from 400 BC to 280. Basically, from 400 years before Christ to 200 years after Jesus was approximately born. So that's a time frame of about 600 years for this 1 Enoch, ideas upon ideas written over time. Now, Enoch himself in the Bible is a really interesting and mysterious character. According to Genesis, he never tasted death because, well, he was not, for God took him. Meaning, well, God took him. He didn't die and go to heaven. After 365 years of life, he, right up with God, just like Elijah. Now, he's a very, very interesting guy. And there's like, beyond that, nothing is said about him in Scripture more in depth. But based on when the Book of Enoch, so there's a difference between Enoch himself and the Book of Enoch. When the Book of Enoch was actually written, we know Enoch himself didn't write it. Like I said before, dated from around 400 BC to 200 AD. Enoch himself was way at the time of Genesis, and there's no evidence to think that Enoch actually wrote the Book of Enoch. So takeaway number 1, Enoch did not actually write the Book of Enoch. There's no evidence to think that he did. So, as a result, we should be, flat out, we shouldn't accept it as Scripture. We should be hesitant to accept its status as Scripture. And it's not just us. If you look, the Jews as a common people, they did not accept Enoch or the apocryphal books. Again, these books were in between the Old and New Testaments as part. I got my comb in my hand. They didn't consider it a part of the Old Testament or the Hebrew Scriptures. So the Jews didn't consider Enoch or these types of books to be a part of the Old Testament. And we can even quote Josephus, who was a historian during Jesus' time, about this further. And then when you're getting to the New Testament, the Christians didn't think, back up a little bit. The New Testament, as we know now, as it was called, didn't come into play by that name until a couple centuries later. But very early on, the Christians believed, even within about like the second generation of Christians and followers of the disciples themselves, they believed that the apostles' writings were inspired. So in the same way they believed the apostles' writings were inspired, they didn't believe that Enoch was inspired. So it's X for Old Testament and X for New Testament. The Jews, didn't believe it was considered a part of the Hebrew scriptures, and the Christians didn't believe it was inspired of the Spirit like the writings of the apostles were. Now, understand that was a big criteria for the early church. If what you were writing, what was written, was actually written by the person who said it was written. See, if you get to Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, which are the biographies of Jesus, the earliest traditions, reliable traditions, point that Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John were actually written by Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. So people in the early church, again, within the second generation of Christians, people who would have trained at the disciples' feet and things like that, they believe these things to actually been written by the apostles. So if they're actually written by who was written by, that's thumbs up. They have apostolic authority. Basically, think apostle. The apostle of Jesus wrote this, we trust it. We use that same standard. Enoch didn't actually write the Book of Enoch, therefore we shouldn't trust it in either testament as scripture. So, it's not scripture. That doesn't mean we should spit on it. See, in a couple of videos ago, I was talking about 1 Peter 3 and about the spirits in prison. And I compared it to the Book of Enoch. See, what happened is the Book of Enoch here, it looked at Genesis 6, which is this really interesting story about how the sons of God saw that females were attractive, and they started having sex with them. But this wasn't any normal thing because we have this human and divine sexual union that caused these, half human, half divine Nephilim to be born, which are giants. That's the way it was understood. I think we should still understand it in the same way. Giants. That's definitely the way people in Jesus' day understood it. Point is, when you have angels, angelic beings, and humans come together, the children aren't going to be normal. So Genesis 6 is the story where they're having relations with women. Enoch looks at that and makes its own story about the fallen angels or the watchers going off of Genesis 6. And it goes into how they sinned by doing this sexual thing with women. So in the Book of Enoch, God doesn't have forgiveness for these fallen angels, and they remain in prison, or as the New Testament calls it, chains of gloomy darkness, until the final judgment. So, here's the important thing.